The Complete Philosophy of Cicero, the orator who made wisdom speak to power. In the grand tapestry of human thought, few figures bridge the worlds of philosophy and practical action as brilliantly as Marcus Tullius Cicero. Born in the small Italian town of Arpinum in 106 BCE, this remarkable man would become known as the father of Latin prose, the greatest orator of Rome, a title that barely captures the enormity of his intellectual and political contributions to humanity. Cicero stands as perhaps the most complete Roman thinker in history, a man who mastered Greek philosophy only to translate it into a language and form that would shape Western civilization for 2,000 years. What makes Cicero extraordinary is not merely his brilliance, though his eloquence was legendary, nor is it simply his productivity, although he authored over 50 philosophical works and hundreds of letters that survive to this day. What sets him apart is the radical conviction that philosophy must serve life, that wisdom without action is sterile, and that the highest calling is to bring philosophical insight into the messy reality of politics, law, and human affairs. His philosophy emerges from one of the most dramatic political and intellectual contexts in recorded history. At the height of his career, while serving as consul of Rome and defending the Republic against conspiracies and dictators, Cicero faced the fundamental crisis of his age. How can philosophy guide action when the world is collapsing into civil war? How can reason prevail when ambitious men reach for absolute power? This crisis could have driven him to retreat into academic contemplation, as it drove many Greek philosophers before him. Instead, it became the foundation for a philosophical synthesis that would preserve ancient wisdom, transform it for a new civilization, and influence not only Roman thought, but medieval Christianity, Renaissance humanism, Enlightenment political philosophy, and the founding principles of modern democracy. Cicero's genius lies in his ability to make philosophy practical without making it shallow. He was simultaneously a profound student of Greek thought and an original Roman thinker, a defender of traditional republican values and a revolutionary transformer of philosophical discourse, a master of abstract reasoning, and a passionate advocate for justice in concrete cases. He showed how Stoic ethics could guide political decisions, how academic skepticism could sharpen legal arguments, how understanding nature could inform virtue, and how the pursuit of wisdom could serve the common good. The journey we are about to undertake through Cicero's complete philosophical system will reveal a mind of extraordinary versatility and depth. We will discover how he developed a theory of natural law that would become foundational to Western legal tradition, and how his understanding of the relationship between contemplation and action offers solutions to problems that still perplex us today. Part 1. The Making of a Philosophical Statesman. The story of Cicero's philosophical development reads like the biography of an age. Picture this. The year is 79 BCE, and a young Cicero, barely 27 years old, travels to Greece and Asia Minor not as a tourist, but as a man on a desperate mission of self-education. Rome is emerging from a brutal civil war. The dictator Sulla has just retired, and the political world is in chaos. Cicero's health is fragile. He has been warned by physicians that his intense oratorical style is literally killing him. But his ambition burns fiercely. He arrives in Athens, the intellectual capital of the ancient world, and throws himself into philosophical study with the same intensity he had brought to Roman law and oratory. But this is not the casual education of a dilettante. Cicero studies at the academy with Antiochus of Ascalon, learning the skeptical method that would shape his entire approach to philosophy. He attends the lectures of the Epicurean Zeno and debates with Stoic philosophers. He studies rhetoric with the greatest teachers of the age. Most crucially, he learns to see philosophy not as an escape from political life, but as essential preparation for it. What distinguishes Cicero's philosophical education from that of most Romans before him is his complete immersion. While previous Roman aristocrats had dabbled in Greek philosophy, treating it as a cultural ornament or a source of ethical platitudes. Cicero recognized that the great questions of Greek philosophy about knowledge, virtue, justice, the nature of the gods, the purpose of human life, were not abstract puzzles, but vital guides for navigating the political and moral complexities of Roman public life. Yet Cicero never became simply a Roman mouthpiece for Greek ideas. From the beginning, he saw his mission as transformative rather than merely transmissive. The Greeks had developed philosophical systems of extraordinary sophistication, but they had done so in a language and cultural context foreign to Rome. Greek philosophy spoke of contemplative withdrawal from public life, of the philosopher as separate from and superior to the politician. But Rome was a culture built on public service, on the ideal of the citizen who contributes to the republic through military service, political leadership, and legal advocacy. Cicero's great innovation was to create a genuinely Roman philosophy, one that preserved the intellectual rigor of Greek thought while adapting it to Roman values and circumstances. He would write philosophy in Latin, a language that many Greeks considered too crude for philosophical subtlety. He would make philosophy speak not to withdrawn academics, but to active statesmen, lawyers, and citizens. He would show how philosophical wisdom could guide the consul, the senator, the advocate, and the judge. The crisis that drove Cicero's philosophical mission was not merely personal, but civilizational. Rome in the 1st century BCE was experiencing a fundamental transformation. The old republican system of shared power and citizen virtue was breaking down under the pressure of military conquest, enormous wealth, and the ambitions of powerful generals. Traditional Roman religion, based on ritual and ancestral custom rather than philosophical reflection, seemed inadequate for addressing the moral and political challenges of an empire. Greek philosophy offered sophisticated ethical systems and theories of knowledge, but in forms that seemed disconnected from Roman practical concerns. Cicero saw that Rome needed a philosophical foundation for its values and institutions, a theoretical understanding of justice that could ground its legal system, an ethics that could guide its leaders, a political philosophy that could articulate why republican government was worth preserving. Without such foundations, Roman power would lack legitimacy, and Roman civic life would lack direction. Philosophy was not a luxury for Cicero, but a necessity for civilization itself. His first major philosophical work, De Republica, On the Republic, written at the height of his political career, laid out this vision with stunning clarity. Drawing on Plato's Republic but adapting it to Roman circumstances, Cicero argued that the best constitution combines elements of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy, precisely the mixed constitution he saw embodied in the Roman Republic at its best. But more than this, he grounded political legitimacy in natural law, the idea that there are principles of justice inherent in nature itself, accessible to human reason, and binding on all peoples. This theory of natural law would become one of Cicero's most influential contributions to Western thought. True law, he wrote, is right reason in agreement with nature. It is of universal application, unchanging and everlasting. It is a sin to try to alter this law, nor is it allowable to attempt to repeal any part of it, and it is impossible to abolish it entirely. Here was a standard by which human laws could be judged, a foundation for justice that transcended the customs of any particular society, a basis for human rights that would echo through the centuries. But Cicero's philosophical education took a dramatic turn in 58 BCE when his political enemies forced him into exile. Banished from Rome, his property confiscated, separated from his beloved daughter Tullia, Cicero experienced the darkest period of his life. The man who had saved Rome from Catiline's conspiracy, who had reached the pinnacle of Roman political success, despite being a new man, with no aristocratic ancestors, found himself utterly powerless. This crisis could have broken him. Instead, it deepened his philosophy. In exile, Cicero confronted existential questions about the sources of human happiness, the value of political achievement, the role of fortune in human life. He studied Stoic teachings about accepting what cannot be changed and maintaining inner freedom regardless of external circumstances. He reflected on Platonic ideas about the immortality of the soul and rewards beyond this life. He considered Epicurean arguments that withdrawal from politics might lead to greater tranquility. When Cicero returned from exile after 18 months, he was both more vulnerable and more philosophically mature. He had learned through bitter experience that political success is fragile, that public service can lead to persecution as easily as to glory, that the life of action must be sustained by inner resources that philosophy provides. These lessons would shape all his subsequent work, giving his philosophy a depth born of suffering and a realism born of political defeat as well as victory. The final transformation of Cicero's philosophical mission came in the last years of his life, after the assassination of Julius Caesar in 44 BCE and the political chaos that followed. Cicero was now in his early 60s, having lived through decades of civil war, having seen the republic he loved gradually succumb to military strongmen. His beloved daughter Tullia had died, leaving him grief-stricken. His political influence was waning as younger men like Mark Antony and Octavian maneuvered for power. In this period of forced retirement from active politics, Cicero produced an astonishing burst of philosophical writing. In less than 2 years, he composed most of his major philosophical works: De Finibus, on moral ends; Tusculan Disputations; De Natura Deorum, on the nature of the gods; De Divinatione, on divination; De Fato, on fate; De Officiis, on duties, and others. This was not the leisurely philosophical activity of a retired gentleman, but an urgent mission to preserve philosophical wisdom for a civilization he feared was collapsing. Cicero explicitly understood his late philosophical writings as a gift to Rome and to future generations. "While our country was being ruled by your counsels and leadership," he wrote to his friend Varro, "I roamed through the Roman Forum, defending my fellow citizens. But since the Republic was taken over entirely by one man, there is no longer any place for that service or counsel of mine. I betook myself to these studies as the most honourable and suitable consolation available." This was philosophy born of necessity, not the playful speculation of an academic with unlimited time, but the concentrated wisdom of a man who knew his days were numbered and wanted to leave something of permanent value. When Cicero was murdered on December 7th, 43 BCE, assassinated by agents of Mark Antony in the proscriptions that followed Caesar's death, his philosophical legacy was complete. The hands that had written philosophy and the tongue that had spoken for the Republic were cut off and displayed in the Forum as a warning to others. But the ideas those hands had written and that tongue had expressed would outlive the assassins and the empire itself. Part 2. The Architecture of Roman Philosophy. Cicero's great achievement was not to invent a new philosophical system, but to create a new way of doing philosophy, one that would serve Roman culture and, through Rome, the Western world. To understand this achievement, we must grasp how radically Cicero transformed the very nature and purpose of philosophical discourse. Greek philosophy by Cicero's time had developed into several distinct schools, each with its own systematic doctrines, institutional structure, and way of life. The Stoics taught that virtue alone is sufficient for happiness, and that we should accept fate with equanimity. The Epicureans argued that pleasure, understood as freedom from pain and disturbance, is the highest good, and that we should withdraw from politics to cultivate friendship and tranquility. The academics practiced systematic skepticism, suspending judgment on all contested questions. The Peripatetics followed Aristotle in studying all aspects of reality through empirical observation and logical analysis. These schools engaged in constant debate, each defending its doctrines against rivals. But for most Greeks, philosophy remained primarily a contemplative activity. a search for truth about the nature of reality, conducted by specialists largely separated from political life. Even Aristotle, who had been tutor to Alexander the Great, treated politics as a subject for theoretical analysis, rather than a field for philosophical practice. Cicero radically transformed this model by insisting that philosophy's primary purpose is to guide action. "There seems to me to be no point in studying philosophy," he wrote in the Tusculan Disputations, "if we do not put it to practical use." This was not anti-intellectualism. Cicero's philosophical writings demonstrate sophisticated engagement with complex theoretical issues, but rather a fundamental reorientation of philosophy's purpose. Philosophical wisdom should not be hoarded by contemplative specialists, but should inform the decisions of active citizens, statesmen, lawyers, and generals. This practical orientation led Cicero to adopt what scholars call academic skepticism as his philosophical method. Following the approach he had learned from Antiochus and other academic philosophers, Cicero refused to commit himself dogmatically to any single philosophical system. Instead, he presented the arguments of different schools fairly, examined their strengths and weaknesses, and aimed at probability rather than absolute certainty. This skeptical method had several advantages for Cicero's purposes. First, it allowed him to draw on insights from multiple philosophical traditions rather than being confined to one school's doctrines. When discussing ethics, he could use Stoic arguments about virtue, peripatetic insights about external goods, and Epicurean observations about pleasure, synthesizing them into a more comprehensive view than any single school provided. Second, the skeptical method suited Cicero's training as an orator and advocate. In Roman courts and political debates, the goal was not to demonstrate absolute truth, but to argue persuasively for the most probable and reasonable position. Cicero's philosophical dialogues often read like courtroom debates, with representatives of different schools presenting their cases, and the reader left to judge which arguments are most convincing. Third, skepticism protected Cicero from the charge of impiety or innovation that might come from dogmatic adherence to controversial doctrines. By presenting philosophy as an investigation rather than a set of fixed conclusions, he could explore radical ideas about the nature of the gods, the mortality of the soul, the relativity of justice, without necessarily endorsing them. This was particularly important in Rome, where innovation in religion was viewed with suspicion, and where Cicero himself had political enemies eager to use any excuse against him. But Cicero's skepticism was not absolute or destructive. Unlike more radical skeptics who denied the possibility of any knowledge, Cicero believed that practical wisdom, sufficient for guiding action, could be achieved through careful reasoning about probabilities. "We are not among those who say that nothing is true," he wrote, "but we do say that true things are mixed with false things and resemble them so closely that there is no sure mark by which to judge and assent." From this, it follows that many things are probable, and, though they cannot be grasped as certain, yet they can guide a wise person's life. This epistemological position, that we can achieve practical certainty sufficient for action, even if we cannot achieve theoretical certainty about ultimate questions, perfectly suited Cicero's purpose of creating a philosophy for active citizens, rather than contemplative academics. The statesman doesn't need absolute proof that a policy is best. He needs good reasons to believe it will serve the Republic. The judge doesn't need metaphysical certainty about justice. He needs sound principles to guide his decisions. The individual doesn't need demonstrative proof of what makes life good. He needs reasonable guidance about how to live virtuously. Cicero's second great innovation was linguistic and literary. He deliberately chose to write philosophy in Latin, despite the fact that educated Romans were fluent in Greek, and Latin lacked the philosophical vocabulary that Greek had developed over centuries. This choice was partly patriotic. Cicero wanted to show that Latin could express sophisticated thought, but more fundamentally philosophical. By creating a Latin philosophical vocabulary, Cicero made philosophy accessible to Romans who couldn't or wouldn't read Greek, dramatically expanding its potential audience and influence. The challenge was immense. Greek had precise technical terms for philosophical concepts: eudaimonia for human flourishing, ataraxia for tranquility, logos for reason, just principle, ousia for substance. Latin had no equivalents. Cicero had to invent them, often by giving new meanings to existing Latin words or creating new compounds. He gave us terms like qualitas, quality, moralis, morale, essentia, essence, beatitudo, beatitude, and countless others that became fundamental to Western philosophical vocabulary. But Cicero didn't just translate Greek terms, he transformed philosophical discourse itself. His philosophical writings are mostly cast as dialogues, conversations between real historical figures, often including Cicero himself, set in specific times and places, discussing philosophical questions in elegant Latin prose. This format served multiple purposes. It made philosophy more engaging and accessible than Greek philosophical treatises. It allowed Cicero to present multiple viewpoints without committing himself to one. It connected philosophical arguments to real Roman contexts and concerns, and it demonstrated that philosophy could be beautiful as well as true, that eloquence and wisdom need not be separated. This integration of rhetoric and philosophy was itself controversial. Many Greek philosophers despised rhetoric as the art of making the weaker argument appear stronger, of persuading regardless of truth. Plato had famously attacked the sophists for teaching rhetoric without philosophy. But Cicero argued that true rhetoric requires philosophical wisdom and that philosophy without eloquence is sterile. Wisdom without eloquence does too little for states, he wrote in De Inventione. But eloquence without wisdom is generally too much and profits nothing. The ideal orator, in Cicero's vision, must also be a philosopher, someone who understands human nature, justice, virtue, and the good, and can express this understanding persuasively. Conversely, the philosopher must master rhetoric to make wisdom effective in the world. This integration would become foundational for Roman and later European education, where rhetoric and philosophy were taught together as complementary arts essential for leadership. Cicero's third innovation was to create distinctively Roman forms of philosophical literature that could serve practical purposes while maintaining theoretical sophistication. His dialogues are not just pedagogical devices, but works of art that bring philosophical ideas to life through dramatic characterization, vivid settings, and engaging narratives. Reading Cicero, we don't just learn abstract doctrines. We watch intelligent, educated Romans wrestling with real problems, disagreeing respectfully, testing arguments against experience, and reaching tentative conclusions. Moreover, Cicero adapted philosophical content to Roman concerns. When discussing justice, he uses Roman legal examples. When analyzing courage, he references Roman military heroes. When examining friendship, he considers actual Roman political alliances. When debating the good life, he addresses the specific tensions faced by Roman aristocrats between public service and private cultivation. This grounding in Roman reality made philosophy relevant and compelling in ways that pure Greek philosophy, with its references to Athenian democracy and Greek city-states, could never be for Roman readers. The cumulative effect of these innovations was to create what we might call Roman philosophy. Not a new school with distinctive doctrines, but a distinctive way of doing philosophy that was synthetic rather than systematic, practical rather than purely theoretical, eloquent rather than technical, and addressed to active citizens rather than contemplative specialists. This Roman philosophy would become the dominant form in which ancient wisdom was transmitted to medieval Europe, the Renaissance, and modernity. When we think of ancient philosophy today, we often encounter it first through Cicero's Latin formulations rather than Greek originals. Part 3. The nature of the good. At the heart of any philosophical system lies the question: what is the good for human beings? How should we live? What constitutes happiness or fulfillment? For Cicero, this was not merely an academic question, but the most urgent practical issue facing any thoughtful person trying to navigate life in the turbulent late Republic. Cicero addressed this fundamental question most comprehensively in his work De Finibus Bonorum et Malorum, on the ends of good and evil, written in 45 BCE. The work is structured as a series of dialogues examining the three major Hellenistic answers to the question of the highest good: the Epicurean view that pleasure is the good, the Stoic view that virtue alone is the good, and the academic trig peripatetic view that the good combines virtue with other goods like health, wealth, and honour. The Epicurean position is presented first, with Cicero's friend Torquatus arguing that pleasure, understood properly as freedom from physical pain and mental disturbance, is the natural end of human action. All creatures pursue pleasure and avoid pain from birth, without needing to be taught. Philosophy's purpose is to help us achieve stable pleasure by freeing us from irrational fears, especially fear of death and divine punishment, and by teaching us to live simply, cultivate friendship, and withdraw from the anxieties of political life. Cicero's response to Epicureanism is devastating. He argues that the Epicurean account of pleasure is internally inconsistent, sometimes meaning absence of pain, sometimes meaning positive enjoyment, and that in any case, pleasure cannot be the highest good for human beings. We admire people for virtuous sacrifices that bring them no pleasure. We consider some pleasures shameful and some pains noble. The greatest human achievements in art, science, politics, philosophy itself involve sustained effort and sacrifice that make sense only if we recognize goods beyond pleasure. Most fundamentally, Cicero argues that Epicureanism is incompatible with the active, engaged life that human nature and civic duty require. If pleasure is the goal, then the quiet life of private enjoyment would indeed be best, as Epicurus taught. But this means abandoning public service, neglecting one's duty to family and country, and failing to develop the distinctively human capacities for virtue, excellence, and noble action. For a Roman aristocrat, for whom public service was both duty and identity, Epicureanism represented a kind of philosophical treason. Yet Cicero acknowledged that Epicureanism contained important truths. The Epicurean critique of irrational fears, especially religious superstition, was valuable. The Epicurean emphasis on friendship captured something genuine about human happiness. And the Epicurean ideal of tranquility, freedom from anxiety and disturbance, identified a real component of well-being, even if it couldn't be the whole of the good life. The Stoic position, presented by Cato in the dialogue, offers a radically different answer. Virtue alone is sufficient for happiness, and nothing else is truly good or evil. Health, wealth, reputation, even life itself are indifferent. They have no bearing on true happiness, which consists entirely in living virtuously. The virtuous person is happy even under torture. The vicious person is miserable even in prosperity. Cicero found the Stoic position magnificent in its elevation of virtue, but ultimately implausible in its denial that anything else matters for happiness. Common sense and experience tell us that health is better than sickness, that having resources is better than lacking them, that being honoured is better than being despised, not just instrumentally as means to virtue, but as genuine goods that contribute to a flourishing life. The Stoic position seems to require us to deny obvious truths about human well-being in order to maintain a rigidly logical system. Moreover, Cicero argued, the Stoic view makes morality paradoxical. If virtue is the only good and vice the only evil, then all virtuous actions are equally good, and all vicious actions equally bad. But this contradicts our clear intuition that some right actions are more important than others, and some wrong actions more serious. The Stoics tried to escape this problem through various distinctions, but Cicero found their solutions ad hoc and unconvincing. This position, sometimes called moderate stoicism or peripatetic ethics, has seemed to many readers more realistic and balanced than the rigid alternatives of Epicureanism or strict stoicism. It captures common intuitions about value while maintaining virtue's primacy. It allows philosophy to guide us toward virtue while acknowledging that external circumstances matter. It makes sense of the choices we actually face, between greater and lesser goods, not just between good and evil. Most importantly for Cicero's purposes, this ethical framework supports and requires the active, engaged life of public service. If virtue is the primary good, and virtue consists in excellences like courage, justice, wisdom, and temperance, then the opportunity to exercise these virtues in service to one's community is itself a great good. The life of politics, law, and military service provides scope for virtue that the withdrawn, contemplative life cannot match. Cicero develops this ethical vision further in his works on specific virtues. In De Amicitia, on friendship, he explores how genuine friendship, based on shared virtue and mutual goodwill rather than utility, is both a component of the good life and a context for moral development. True friends make each other better. They provide both the support necessary for maintaining virtue in difficult times and the honest criticism necessary for recognizing and correcting one's faults. In De Senectute, on old age, Cicero addresses the challenge of maintaining virtue and happiness as bodily powers decline. He argues that old age, far from being miserable as many suppose, can be the best time of life if one has cultivated virtue and wisdom. The elderly person who has lived well has the satisfaction of accomplishment, the wisdom born of experience, freedom from youthful passions that disturbed peace of mind, and the opportunity to guide younger generations. The key is to remain engaged and active in appropriate ways rather than withdrawing in bitterness or pursuing youth's pleasures inappropriately. These works demonstrate Cicero's conviction that philosophy must address the concrete challenges of human life, not just the question of what abstract virtue means, but how to maintain friendship in the face of political disagreement, how to age with dignity, how to bear loss, how to balance competing obligations. This practical focus makes Cicero's ethics immediately applicable to lived experience rather than a merely theoretical system. The culmination of Cicero's ethical thinking comes in De Officiis, on duties, his last philosophical work, written in 44 BCE and addressed to his son Marcus, then studying philosophy in Athens. This work is not primarily about the highest good, but about the practical question of what we ought to do, our duties or obligations in concrete circumstances. Cicero organizes ethics around three questions. What is morally right, honestum? What is beneficial or expedient, utile? And when these appear to conflict, which should take priority? His answer to the third question is clear and categorical. The morally right always takes precedence over the merely beneficial. Indeed, Cicero argues, there can never be a genuine conflict between virtue and advantage rightly understood, because only what is morally right can truly benefit us. Apparent conflicts arise from confused thinking about where our true interest lies. This seemingly simple principle has profound implications. It means that political expediency can never justify injustice. Personal benefit can never excuse betrayal. Success achieved through vice is not success, but failure. Nothing can be expedient which is not at the same time morally right, Cicero insists. And nothing is morally right precisely because it is expedient, but rather it is expedient because it is morally right. De Officiis became one of the most influential philosophical works in Western history, second perhaps only to Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. Its clear structure, practical examples, and integration of ethical theory with concrete decision-making made it the standard text on ethics for centuries. When Enlightenment thinkers and American founders thought about duty, justice, and the moral requirements of leadership, they often did so in Ciceronian terms. Part 4. The Foundations of Justice and Law. If Cicero's ethics focused on individual virtue and the good life, his political philosophy addressed the collective question: how should human communities be organized, and what principles should govern their laws and institutions? These questions were not academic for Cicero, but urgent matters of practice, as he watched the Roman Republic, the political system he venerated, collapse under the weight of civil war and the ambitions of military strongmen. Cicero's political philosophy rests on a concept that would become one of his most influential contributions to Western thought: natural law. The idea that justice is not merely conventional, a product of human agreement or social custom, but based on principles inherent in nature itself, accessible to human reason, and binding on all peoples at all times. There is indeed a true law, namely right reason, Cicero wrote in De Republica, which is in accordance with nature, applies to all men, and is unchangeable and eternal. It will not lay down one rule at Rome and another at Athens, nor will it be one rule today and another tomorrow. But there will be one law, eternal and unchangeable, binding at all times upon all peoples. This vision of natural law had revolutionary implications. It meant that human laws could be judged by a higher standard, that a law could be legally valid but morally wrong if it violated natural law. It provided a basis for universal human rights that transcended particular cultures and customs. It suggested that all human beings, regardless of citizenship or status, shared a common moral nature and were bound by common ethical principles. Cicero derived his natural law theory from Stoic philosophy, particularly the Stoic concept of logos, the rational principle that orders the cosmos and is reflected in human reason. But Cicero adapted Stoic cosmology to Roman legal and political concerns, creating a theory that would prove far more influential than its Greek sources. The foundation of natural law for Cicero is the recognition that human beings share a rational nature. Unlike animals, which act by instinct, humans can grasp universal principles, understand cause and effect, recognize their connection to others, and govern their behavior by reason. This rational capacity creates both the possibility and the obligation of justice. We can understand what justice requires, and we are bound to follow its requirements because doing so is living in accordance with our nature as rational beings. From this foundation, Cicero derives several principles of natural law. First, we have duties to all human beings simply because they are human. The bonds of human fellowship extend beyond family, clan, or city to encompass all of humanity. Second, we must respect the rights and property of others. Justice fundamentally consists in giving each person their due and refraining from harming others. Third, we must keep our commitments and honor our agreements. The keeping of faith, fides, is essential to social life. Fourth, we must contribute to the common good of our communities. Private advantage must be constrained by public welfare. These principles might seem obvious or even banal today, but in the ancient world they were revolutionary. Traditional Roman religion justified Roman power through the gods' special favor to Rome. Traditional Greek philosophy often assumed that Greeks were superior to barbarians and that slavery was natural. Cicero's natural law theory, by contrast, implied a universal human dignity and a standard of justice that applied equally to all peoples. This universalism had practical implications for Roman law and politics. It suggested that Rome's rule over conquered peoples could be justified only if it served justice and the common good rather than merely Roman advantage. It implied that slavery, while legally permitted, was contrary to natural law since all humans share rational nature. It provided grounds for criticizing unjust Roman laws and corrupt officials. Cicero applied these principles most systematically in De Legibus, On the Laws, a companion work to De Republica. While De Republica discussed the ideal constitution, De Legibus examined what laws such a state should have, grounding Roman law in natural law principles. Cicero argued that law should serve the common good, protect property and contracts, ensure fair procedures in courts, regulate public religion appropriately, and maintain checks on excessive power. But Cicero's vision of justice extended beyond law to encompass political virtue and leadership. In De Republica, he argues that the best constitution is a mixed one that combines elements of monarchy, executive leadership, aristocracy, senatorial wisdom, and democracy, popular voice, precisely the system he believed Rome embodied at its best. Each element checks the other's excesses. The people restrain aristocratic arrogance, the Senate tempers popular passion, and strong leadership provides unity and direction. Within this mixed constitution, Cicero identified the statesman, the wise and virtuous political leader, as essential for the republic's health. The true statesman combines practical political skill with philosophical wisdom, rhetorical excellence with moral virtue. He serves the common good rather than private interest, maintains justice even at personal cost, and guides the state through crises with wisdom and courage. Cicero's portrait of the ideal statesman is at once a description of Rome's great leaders and a self-portrait, an articulation of what Cicero aspired to be and what he believed he had achieved in his finest moments. The statesman must master rhetoric to persuade and lead. He must understand law to ensure justice. He must grasp philosophy to see beyond immediate pressures to enduring principles. He must possess courage to stand against faction and corruption. Above all, he must love his country more than his own glory. This vision of statesmanship would profoundly influence later political thought, particularly Renaissance humanism and Enlightenment republicanism. When Machiavelli rejected Ciceronian idealism in favor of political realism, he was arguing against Cicero's model of the philosophical statesman. When the American founders thought about the qualities required for republican leadership, they drew heavily on Ciceronian ideals. When we today debate whether political leaders should be judged by moral standards or only by effectiveness, we are continuing an argument that Cicero helped to frame. But Cicero's political philosophy faced a devastating practical challenge: the collapse of the very republic he sought to preserve and understand. Despite Cicero's efforts, his oratory, his consulship, his philosophical defense of republican values, the Roman Republic fell to Caesar's dictatorship, and then, after Caesar's assassination, to the Second Triumvirate, and eventually to Augustus's imperial monarchy. This failure has led some critics to dismiss Cicero's political philosophy as impractical idealism, unrealistic in its demands on leaders and citizens. But this judgment misses what Cicero actually achieved. He provided the theoretical foundations for republican government, natural rights, and the rule of law that would inspire resistance to tyranny and efforts to create just political orders for 2 millennia. His vision of law as based on justice rather than mere power would become foundational to Western legal tradition. His argument that leaders must be bound by moral principles would constrain and critique absolute power throughout history. Moreover, Cicero understood, perhaps better than his critics, the fragility of republican government and the constant threat of tyranny. His political writings are filled with warnings about demagogues who exploit popular passions, ambitious generals who use military power for political ends, and the corruption of civic virtue through luxury and faction. The fall of the Republic confirmed Cicero's fears, but also vindicated his analysis of what makes the republican government vulnerable. In this sense, Cicero's political philosophy remains urgently relevant. His insights into how republics fail, how power corrupts, how demagoguery exploits fear and prejudice, and how civic virtue must be cultivated to sustain free government speak directly to contemporary concerns. His argument that no political system can survive the moral corruption of its citizens remains a challenge to any democratic society. Part 5. The Life of the Mind. While Cicero emphasized philosophy's practical application, he also recognized that the contemplative life has inherent value and that intellectual excellence is itself a form of virtue. His epistemology, his theory of knowledge, and his philosophical method reveal a sophisticated understanding of how human beings come to know truth and how philosophical inquiry should be conducted. As we've seen, Cicero adopted the skeptical method of the new academy, which taught that we cannot achieve absolute certainty about most philosophical questions, but can identify probable truths sufficient to guide action. This position steered between the dogmatism of other schools, which claimed certainty about their doctrines, and the radical skepticism that denied the possibility of any knowledge. But what exactly did Cicero's skepticism involve? In Academica, his most systematic epistemological work, Cicero distinguishes between different types of skepticism. The radical skeptic claims that nothing can be known, and that we should suspend judgment on all questions. The moderate skeptic, Cicero's position, holds that while we cannot achieve absolute certainty, we can identify claims that are more or less probable, and we should proportion our belief to the evidence. This moderate skepticism has several advantages. First, it encourages intellectual humility and openness to revision. Unlike dogmatists who defend their school's doctrines regardless of new evidence or arguments, the skeptic remains willing to change their mind when presented with better reasons. Second, it motivates continued inquiry. If we already possess certain truth, there's no reason to keep investigating. But if our current beliefs are only probable, we have reason to seek stronger evidence and better arguments. Third, it better fits our actual cognitive situation. We don't experience absolute certainty about most philosophical claims, and pretending we do only closes our minds to genuine inquiry. Cicero's skepticism particularly suited his role as a philosophical dialogist. By presenting arguments from multiple schools fairly and allowing readers to judge which are most convincing, Cicero avoids dogmatic teaching while still guiding readers toward more probable truths. His dialogues model philosophical conversation at its best: respectful disagreement, careful argument, openness to various perspectives, and tentative conclusions that invite further thought. But Cicero's skepticism was not purely methodological. It had substantive consequences for his philosophy. It meant that Cicero could draw eclectically on different traditions rather than committing to one system. When Stoic arguments seemed stronger, he followed them. When peripatetic reasoning proved more convincing, he adopted it. This syncretism produced a philosophy more flexible and comprehensive than any single school could offer. Moreover, Cicero's skepticism about theoretical certainty reinforced his emphasis on practical wisdom. If we cannot achieve demonstrative proof about the nature of the gods or the ultimate structure of reality, then philosophy's value lies primarily in its guidance for life, rather than in theoretical knowledge. What matters most is not whether we have metaphysical certainty, but whether we have sufficient understanding to live virtuously and serve our communities well. Cicero's epistemology also addresses the specific question of how we evaluate moral and political claims. In rhetoric and deliberation, we cannot expect mathematical proof. Instead, we must rely on probable arguments based on common experience, reasonable principles, and careful analysis of consequences. The orator and statesman must master the art of identifying probable truths and presenting them persuasively. Not to manipulate audiences, but to guide them towards sound judgment. This connection between epistemology and rhetoric was central to Cicero's intellectual project. He rejected the sharp separation that some philosophers made between the search for truth, philosophy, and persuasive presentation, rhetoric. True rhetoric requires understanding what is probable and true. Effective philosophy requires the ability to express and communicate insight. The complete thinker must master both. Cicero developed this integration most fully in De Oratore, On the Orator, his masterwork on rhetoric written in 55 BCE. The work is structured as a dialogue set in 91 BCE, featuring Rome's greatest orators discussing their art. Through their conversation, Cicero argues that the ideal orator must combine technical skill in speaking with broad, philosophical education. The orator must understand human psychology to move audiences appropriately. He must grasp ethics to argue about justice and duty convincingly. He must comprehend politics to deliberate about laws and policies effectively. He must master logic to construct compelling arguments. In short, the complete orator must be a philosopher, not in the sense of adhering to one philosophical school dogmatically, but in the sense of understanding the fundamental principles of human knowledge and conduct. Conversely, Cicero argues that the philosopher who lacks rhetorical skill fails in their duty to make wisdom accessible and effective. Philosophy that cannot be communicated clearly and persuasively remains sterile, benefiting only the philosopher. To serve humanity, philosophical insight must be expressed in language that moves and convinces, that makes people not just understand but care about and act on truth. This vision of the philosopher-orator, the complete intellectual who combines wisdom with eloquence, would become an educational ideal that shaped Western civilization. The medieval trivium of grammar, rhetoric, and logic reflect Ciceronian priorities. Renaissance humanists explicitly modeled their educational programs on Cicero's vision. Even today, when we expect educated people to think critically and communicate clearly, we are following Ciceronian principles. Cicero also contributed to epistemology through his treatments of specific types of knowledge. In De Divinatione, On Divination, he subjects traditional Roman and Greek methods of predicting the future, augury, astrology, prophecy, dream interpretation, to skeptical analysis. Through detailed arguments and amusing examples, Cicero shows that supposed successful predictions are better explained by coincidence, vague language that fits many outcomes, or fraud than by genuine foreknowledge. This critique was daring in Roman context, where public religion included official divination practices and where political decisions were influenced by augury. Cicero had to argue carefully, distinguishing between respecting traditional religious practices for their civic function and accepting superstitious claims about knowledge of the future. His skepticism about divination reflects both his academic philosophical training and his practical recognition that superstition can corrupt public decision-making. In De Natura Deorum, On the Nature of the Gods, Cicero examines philosophical theology, what we can know about the gods through reason rather than revelation or tradition. Representatives of the Epicurean, Stoic, and academic positions present their views about whether gods exist, what their nature is, and whether they care about human affairs. The Epicurean argues that gods exist, but are perfectly happy beings who do not intervene in human affairs or care about human behavior. The Stoic presents elaborate arguments that the universe is governed by divine providence and that everything happens according to rational, divine plan. The academic skeptic, Cicero's spokesman, critiques both positions, showing difficulties with arguments for divine providence while also noting problems with pure Epicurean detachment. What emerges is not atheism, Cicero affirms basic religious beliefs, but a sophisticated examination of what reason can establish about divinity and where traditional religious practices should be accepted on grounds other than philosophical proof. This approach would influence later Christian and Islamic philosophers wrestling with the relationship between reason and revelation, philosophical theology and religious faith. Part 6. The psychology of excellence. Cicero's philosophical psychology, his understanding of human nature, emotion, character, and moral development, provides the foundation for his ethics and his theory of virtue. Unlike modern psychology, which aims at scientific description of how the mind works, Cicero's psychology is normative, concerned with how we should manage our mental life to achieve excellence and happiness. The most systematic presentation of Cicero's psychology appears in the Tusculan Disputations, 5 books of philosophical dialogue written in 45 BCE. Each book addresses a source of human misery and argues that philosophy can provide relief. Book 1 tackles fear of death. Book 2 treats pain. Book 3 examines grief and distress. Book 4 analyzes disturbing emotions. And Book 5 addresses whether virtue alone is sufficient for happiness. The overall argument is that most human suffering comes not from external circumstances, but from false beliefs and disordered emotions that philosophy can correct. We fear death because we falsely believe it is evil. We are crushed by grief because we think we have lost an irreplaceable good. We are disturbed by anger, fear, or desire because we have false judgments about what matters. Philosophical therapy consists in correcting these false judgments through argument and reflection. This cognitive approach to emotion was influenced by Stoic psychology, which held that emotions, path, are essentially judgments or involve judgments. To feel fear is to judge that something bad is about to happen. To feel angry is to judge that someone has wronged you and deserves punishment. To feel grief is to judge that you have lost something good. Since these are judgments, they can be evaluated rationally, and if they rest on false beliefs, they can be corrected through philosophical argument. Consider Cicero's treatment of grief in Book 3. When we lose someone we love, we naturally feel pain. But this pain becomes pathological grief, the kind that crushes us and makes life seem unbearable. Only when we add false judgments to it, that the loss is an unmitigated evil, that we cannot go on without the person, that our grief honors the deceased. Philosophical therapy shows that these judgments are false. Death is not evil for the person who dies. They either no longer exist or have passed to a better state. We can and must continue living and fulfilling our duties. True honor to the deceased comes from remembering them well and carrying on their values, not from being destroyed by their loss. Cicero himself had profound personal experience with grief. His beloved daughter Tullia died in February 45 BCE, and her death devastated him. He withdrew to one of his villas and immersed himself in philosophical writing, partly as therapy for his grief. The Tusculan Disputations reflects both his philosophical conviction that wisdom can help us bear loss and his personal struggle to apply philosophy to overwhelming pain. The work illustrates philosophy's therapeutic function, not offering empty consolation or denying pain's reality, but providing perspective and understanding that makes suffering bearable. Philosophy doesn't eliminate grief, but transforms it from destructive passion into appropriate acknowledgement of loss that can coexist with continued living and duty. Cicero's analysis of disturbing emotions in Book 4 provides a more detailed account of psychological pathology. He distinguishes 4 primary disturbing emotions: distress, about present evils; fear, about future evils; pleasure, about present goods; and appetite for future goods. Each involves false judgment that something indifferent, health, wealth, reputation, is truly good or evil. The wise person, by contrast, experiences appropriate emotions, eupatheiai, that don't rest on false judgments: joy, about genuine goods like virtue; caution, about genuine evils like vice; and wishing for genuine goods. The wise person doesn't feel grief over losing wealth, since wealth isn't truly good, but does feel appropriate pain at their own moral failings, which are genuine evils. This Stoic-influenced analysis might seem to demand emotional suppression, becoming so detached that nothing disturbs us. But Cicero insists on distinguishing between eliminating disturbing passions, which rest on false judgments, and eliminating all feeling. The wise person isn't emotionless, but has appropriate emotional responses calibrated to true value. They care deeply about virtue and injustice. They just don't mistake health, wealth, or reputation for ultimate goods. Cicero's psychology also addresses character formation, how people become virtuous or vicious. Unlike some philosophers who treated virtue as primarily intellectual, a matter of knowing what's right, Cicero recognized that becoming virtuous requires habitual training of both reason and emotion. Children must be taught not just what virtue requires, but must practice virtuous actions until they become habitual. They must learn to feel appropriate emotions, to be angry at injustice, compassionate towards suffering, delighted by noble actions. This attention to moral education reflects both peripatetic influence, Aristotle emphasized habituation in ethics, and Roman practical concerns. Cicero wrote De Officiis as a guide for his son, trying to shape the young man's character through philosophical instruction. He understood that philosophical wisdom must be combined with proper upbringing, good examples, and practice in virtuous action if it is to produce genuinely good people. Cicero's psychological insights extend to understanding practical reasoning and deliberation. In De Officiis, he analyzes how we should think through difficult choices where different duties or goods seem to conflict. Should we keep a promise that has become harmful? Should we tell a truth that will cause pain? Should we sacrifice private interest for public good? Cicero provides not rigid rules but a method of moral reasoning. Identify what duties are at stake. Recognize which take priority. Duty to humanity over duty to friends. Duty to country over private interest. Consider consequences honestly, and apply principles consistently. This casuistical approach, reasoning carefully about particular cases, would become central to Western moral thought, particularly in Catholic moral theology and later applied ethics. Cicero's psychology addresses the question of moral motivation. Why be virtuous? Why should we choose justice over advantage, duty over pleasure, virtue over success? Cicero offers multiple answers, showing the complexity of moral motivation. Part 7. Religion, Fate, and Providence. Cicero lived in a world saturated with religious practice and belief, yet also marked by philosophical skepticism about traditional religion. Roman state religion involved elaborate rituals and augury. Popular religion included worship of numerous gods and belief in their intervention in human affairs. Philosophical schools debated whether gods exist, what their nature is, and whether they care about humanity. As both a philosopher and a priest, he held the office of augur. Cicero had to navigate between religious tradition and philosophical skepticism, between public piety and private doubt. His religious writings reflect this complex position, attempting to preserve what is valuable in traditional religion, while subjecting superstition and false belief to rational criticism. De Natura Deorum presents the most comprehensive ancient discussion of rational theology. The dialogue stages a debate among representatives of three philosophical schools. Velleius the Epicurean argues that gods exist as perfect, blessed beings, utterly unconcerned with human affairs. They neither created the universe nor govern it through providence. They simply exist in eternal happiness, serving as models of blessed life but having no interaction with humans. Balbus the Stoic offers elaborate arguments for divine providence. The universe's order and regularity, the adaptation of organisms to their environments, the existence of consciousness and reason, all point to intelligent divine design and governance. The gods, or God, Stoics, wavered between monotheism and polytheism, actively maintain cosmic order and care for humanity, rewarding virtue and punishing vice. Cotta the academic representing Cicero's own school, subjects both positions to skeptical critique. Against the Epicurean, he argues that gods who do nothing and care for nothing are not properly called gods at all. Against the Stoic, he notes that the argument from design proves too much. Why did providential gods create harmful things? And too little. Regular order might result from natural necessity rather than deliberate design. The existence of evil and suffering raises difficult questions for any theory of benevolent providence. Cicero's own position emerges cautiously. He seems to accept that gods exist and that traditional Roman religion has social value, even if its specific claims aren't philosophically defensible. Basic piety, belief in divine beings worthy of reverence, religious practices that promote virtue and social cohesion should be maintained. But superstitious beliefs that the gods micromanage human affairs or that future events can be predicted through divination should be rejected. This moderate position reflects Cicero's broader philosophical method: preserve what is valuable in tradition while correcting errors through rational criticism. Roman religion at its best promoted virtue, social cohesion, and reverence for something beyond human will. But popular religion often degenerated into superstition that corrupted both philosophy and politics. Cicero's critique of divination in De Divinatione reflects this concern. He subjects various methods of supposedly foretelling the future, examining animal entrails, interpreting dreams, watching bird flights, casting lots, to devastating, skeptical analysis. If these methods worked, we should see consistent, verifiable predictions. Instead, we see vague pronouncements that fit many outcomes, memorable successes that are actually rare coincidences, and much fraud. More seriously, belief in divination corrupts political deliberation. When important decisions are made or postponed based on supposed divine signs rather than careful reasoning about what serves the common good, the Republic suffers. Cicero, who as augur had official responsibilities for interpreting divine signs, was in a delicate position. He argues that traditional augury should be maintained for its ceremonial role, but that intelligent people shouldn't actually believe future events can be read in bird flights. The question of fate and free will troubled ancient philosophy, as it has troubled all later philosophy. If everything happens by necessity, fate, how can humans be responsible for their choices? If nothing happens by necessity, how can there be order and predictability in nature? Cicero addresses this problem in De Fato, on fate, though unfortunately only fragments of this work survive. From what remains, we can see that Cicero rejected hard determinism, the view that everything is fated and humans have no genuine agency. This view, he argued, destroys morality by eliminating responsibility. If our choices are determined by prior causes beyond our control, we can't be praised for virtue or blamed for vice. Law and deliberation become pointless. But Cicero also rejected pure chance or randomness. Some events happen by necessity, the sun rises, some by probability, it might rain, and some through human choice. This middle position, sometimes called compatibilism, holds that human choices are genuinely free, even though they occur within a world governed by natural regularities. Cicero's discussion of fate and freedom connects to his political philosophy. Tyranny claims that one person's will should govern all. Democratic excess claims that all choices are equally valid. Cicero's middle position, that humans have genuine but limited freedom within a natural and moral order, supports republican government where citizens exercise real choice but are bound by natural law and civic duty. These religious and metaphysical discussions might seem abstract, but for Cicero they had practical importance. Fatalism excuses passivity and irresponsibility. Excessive belief in providence makes people expect divine intervention rather than taking responsibility for reform. Superstition corrupts judgment and enables manipulation. Atheism removes moral accountability and undermines social bonds. Cicero sought a religious sensibility that would support virtue and civic responsibility while avoiding superstitious error. His solution, rational theology that acknowledges divine reality without making specific claims about divine intervention, religious practice valued for its social and moral functions rather than its literal truth, skepticism about attempts to predict or control divine action, would influence later thinkers trying to reconcile faith with reason. Part 8. The Council of Friendship. Among Cicero's philosophical works, De Amicitia, On Friendship, holds a special place for its beautiful prose, profound insight, and direct relevance to human life. Written in 44 BCE after Caesar's assassination, the work takes the form of a dialogue featuring Laelius, a historical figure renowned for his friendship with Scipio Africanus the Younger, discussing the nature of friendship after Scipio's death. Cicero's choice of subject reflects both personal experience and philosophical conviction. Throughout his life, Cicero formed deep friendships that sustained him through political crises and personal losses. His correspondence preserves a vivid record of these friendships, the intimacy, support, conflict, and reconciliation that mark genuine human connection. Writing about friendship was also a way to honor those friends who had died and to reflect on what made these relationships meaningful. But friendship was also a philosophical topic central to ancient ethics. All philosophical schools recognized friendship as crucial to happiness. They disagreed about its basis and nature. Epicureans saw friendship as based on mutual utility. We befriend others because they benefit us. Stoics argued that only the wise can be true friends, since only they possess virtue. Aristotle distinguished different types of friendship based on utility, pleasure, or shared virtue, with only the last constituting genuine friendship. Cicero follows Aristotle in holding that true friendship must be based on virtue rather than utility or pleasure. Friends for advantage are really business partners. When the advantage ends, so does the relationship. Friends for pleasure are really entertainment companions. When the pleasure fades, the friendship dissolves. Only those who are drawn together by shared virtue and mutual goodwill, who wish well to each other for the other's sake, achieve genuine friendship. This view might seem to make friendship rare. If only the virtuous can be true friends, and virtue is rare, then true friendship must be rare. Cicero acknowledges this consequence but embraces it. Most relationships that go by the name of friendship are really alliances, associations, or pleasant companionships. Genuine friendship, where each person is committed to the other's good, where trust is complete, where disagreement doesn't destroy connection, this is indeed rare and precious. But Cicero insists that friendship, while based on virtue, is not reducible to virtue. We don't form friendships simply because others are virtuous or to make ourselves more virtuous. Friendship involves genuine affection, a particular bond with this person, not just appreciation of virtue in general. The friend is loved for themselves, not as an instance of virtue or a means to self-improvement. This personal quality of friendship creates potential conflicts with other duties. What do we owe friends that we don't owe to all virtuous people? May we help friends at others' expense? Should we assist friends who are doing wrong? These questions weren't merely theoretical for Cicero, who navigated complex political alliances where personal friendship often conflicted with public duty. Cicero's answer is characteristically balanced. Friends deserve special loyalty and support. Friendship creates obligations beyond general justice. We should help friends advance honest careers, defend their reputation when attacked unjustly, and stand by them in adversity. But friendship cannot justify injustice. We must refuse to help friends do wrong, and we must be honest with friends about their faults even when honesty strains the relationship. This position reflects Cicero's conviction that all goods must be harmonized. Friendship can't truly conflict with virtue because virtue is what makes friendship possible and valuable. A friend who asks us to act unjustly either isn't a true friend or has been corrupted by vice. True friendship supports and reinforces virtue rather than conflicting with it. Cicero also addresses the practical cultivation of friendship. How do friendships form? What sustains them? What destroys them? He observes that friendships typically begin through some initial attraction, similarity of interests, circumstances that bring people together, admiration for another's qualities. But friendship develops only through shared experience, honest communication, and mutual revelation. Sustaining friendship requires effort. Friends must make time for each other, engage in common pursuits, communicate openly, and support each other through difficulties. Distance strains friendships, but shouldn't destroy them. True friends remain connected even when separated. Disagreement tests friendships. Friends must be able to disagree without breaking bonds, offering honest counsel even when unwelcome. What destroys friendship? Betrayal of confidence, discovering that apparent friendship was based on utility, failing to support friends in need, allowing political or ideological differences to sever personal bonds. Cicero offers a striking reflection on political friendships. In times of civil conflict, many friendships break over political loyalties. He suggests that true friendship should survive such conflicts, that personal bonds ought to transcend political disagreement. Yet Cicero himself experienced the strain of political division on friendship. Some friends sided with Caesar, others with Pompey and the Senate. Some supported the Republic, others accepted monarchy. These weren't abstract differences, but matters of life and death, power and principle. Cicero's idealization of friendship that transcends politics reflects his pain at these divisions. The dialogue's setting is significant. Laelius discusses friendship after the death of Scipio, his closest friend. This frames the entire discussion with awareness of friendship's fragility, that even the strongest bonds are broken by death. Yet Laelius affirms that the pain of loss doesn't make friendship less valuable. Better to have loved and lost than never to have experienced such connection. This meditation on friendship in the face of death reflects Cicero's own losses. Tullia recently dead, many friends killed in civil wars, the political friendships of his consulship destroyed by faction. Writing about ideal friendship was partly consolation, partly preservation of what was valuable, partly hope that such relationships remained possible even in dark times. De Amicitia influenced later thought about friendship profoundly. Medieval and Renaissance thinkers cited it constantly. The ideal of friendship based on virtue rather than advantage, the integration of friendship with ethics, the analysis of friendship's obligations and limits, all became standard topics in Western philosophy. Perhaps most importantly, Cicero elevated friendship to philosophical dignity. Greek philosophy often treated friendship as important, but secondary to individual virtue and wisdom. Cicero showed that friendship is itself a primary human good, essential to complete happiness, and worthy of philosophical reflection at the highest level. The life well lived requires not just virtue, but connection, the presence of those who know us fully, share our commitments, and remain loyal through change and adversity. Thom, Part 9. Growing Old with Dignity. If De Amicitia celebrates a bond that enriches life, De Senectute, on old age, addresses a challenge that life inevitably brings to those who don't die young. How to face the decline of bodily powers while maintaining dignity, purpose, and happiness. Written in 44 BCE when Cicero was 62 and addressed to his friend Atticus, who was 65, the work reflects Cicero's personal confrontation with aging and his determination to find philosophical resources for meeting it well. The dialogue features Cato the Elder, the stern Roman moralist who lived to 85, discussing old age at age 84. Through Cato, Cicero responds to 4 common complaints about old age: that it removes us from active life, that it weakens the body, that it deprives us of sensual pleasures, and that it brings us near to death. To the first complaint, that old age removes us from active pursuits, Cicero responds that it removes us from physical activities that should be left to youth anyway, while opening opportunities for activities better suited to experience and wisdom. The elderly can't serve as soldiers, but they can serve as counselors. They can't compete in athletics, but they can judge competitions. They can't undertake new business ventures, but they can manage resources accumulated through life. More profoundly, old age allows focus on intellectual and cultural pursuits that youth lacks time for. Cato describes studying Greek in old age, writing history, engaging in philosophical discussion. For Cicero, who produced most of his philosophical works in his final years, this wasn't empty consolation, but lived reality. Forced from active politics, he created works that would influence civilization for 2 millennia. This response assumes a life that has been well lived, that has achieved something, accumulated resources, developed wisdom, cultivated worthwhile interests. Cicero acknowledges that old age is miserable for those who reach it empty. No accomplishments to reflect on, no wisdom gained, no interests beyond bodily pleasure, no younger people they've helped who now care for them. But this misery results from life lived badly, not from age itself. To the complaint that old age weakens the body, Cicero responds that this weakness is relative and often exaggerated. The elderly can't do what the young can, but they can still do much if they maintain health through moderate living. More importantly, youth's strength is often misused in debauchery, violence, excess. Age's weakness protects from these misuses. The real point, however, is that physical strength isn't what matters most for a good human life. What matters is wisdom, virtue, judgment, experience, qualities that may actually improve with age as physical power declines. The elderly who lived well have precisely what is most valuable, even as they lose what is less important. Cicero's most striking argument concerns the relationship between age and pleasure. Common opinion holds that old age is miserable because it can't enjoy sensual pleasures, food, drink, sex, with youthful intensity. Cicero responds that this deprivation is actually liberation. The tyranny of youthful passions, the obsession with sexual conquest, the enslavement to appetite, the emotional turbulence of desire and disappointment, fades with age, allowing focus on higher goods. This argument draws on both Stoic ideas about freedom from disturbing passions and Epicurean themes about the superiority of mental to bodily pleasures. But Cicero develops them with psychological insight. He observes that many elderly people continue to pursue youthful pleasures inappropriately, making themselves ridiculous. The dignity of age requires accepting that different life stages have different appropriate activities and pleasures. What pleasures remain to the old? The satisfaction of achievement and accomplishment, the love of family, particularly grandchildren, the enjoyment of intellectual activity, reading, writing, conversation, the appreciation of nature, cultivated gardens and beautiful surroundings, the friendships of a lifetime, the respect of the community. These pleasures, Cicero argues, are deeper and more stable than youth's passionate intensities. The final complaint, that old age brings us near to death, receives Cicero's most philosophically sophisticated response. Drawing on arguments from Tusculan disputations, he offers several considerations that should eliminate fear of death. First, if death is complete annihilation, then it isn't something we experience. We simply cease to exist. How can ceasing to exist be bad for us? We don't regret not existing before birth. Why fear not existing after death? Second, if the soul survives death, as Cicero inclines to believe following Plato, then death releases us from bodily limitations to a purely intellectual existence. The philosopher's death is literally a liberation of soul from body, allowing complete devotion to truth. Third, a life well lived gives us reason to face death calmly. Someone who has fulfilled their duties, contributed to their community, maintained virtue, and left worthy accomplishments can face death knowing their life had meaning and value. Death can't take away what we've already been and done. Fourth, nature itself shows us that death is natural and appropriate. All living things die after completing their life cycle. Human beings who have lived full lives reach a natural end, like fruit that falls when ripe. Fighting this natural process is futile and undignified. These arguments don't necessarily prove death isn't evil or that we should welcome it. Rather, they show that death need not be feared as the ultimate horror, and that facing it calmly is possible for those who have lived virtuously. The fear of death that torments youth, seeming to lose everything just when life becomes established, should lessen for the elderly who have already lived and accomplished what matters most. The Senectute concludes with Cato expressing confidence that he will soon join his deceased friends and family in an afterlife, continuing the conversation and companionship that made life valuable. Whether this represents Cicero's genuine belief or a consoling fiction is unclear. What's clear is that Cicero found in philosophy resources for facing age and death with dignity, understanding that physical decline is not spiritual decline, that different life stages have different goods, and that a life well lived provides its own justification regardless of what follows. The work's influence extended far beyond philosophy. For centuries, it shaped how Western culture thought about aging, providing an alternative to viewing old age as simply decline and loss. It offered a vision of elderly dignity based on wisdom, virtue, and continued engagement rather than withdrawal. And it modeled how philosophical reflection can help us face life's challenges with courage and grace. Part 10. The Supreme Guide on Duties. In October 44 BCE, with political chaos engulfing Rome after Caesar's assassination, and Cicero himself in danger from the triumvirate, Cicero completed his final and perhaps most influential philosophical work, De Officiis, on Duties. Addressed to his son Marcus, then studying philosophy in Athens, the work was conceived as a father's practical ethical guidance, but developed into a systematic treatment of moral duties that would shape Western ethics for 2 millennia. De Officiis represents the culmination of Cicero's philosophical project, making Greek wisdom serve Roman life. The work draws heavily on Stoic ethics, particularly the work of Panayiotis, but adapts and develops it for Roman circumstances. It addresses not abstract questions about the highest good, but practical questions about what we ought to do in concrete situations. The guide for the statesman, the citizen, the professional, anyone trying to live virtuously in the complex social world. The work is organized around 3 questions that arise when we deliberate about action. What is morally right, honestum? What is beneficial or expedient, utile? And when these appear to conflict, which takes precedence? Cicero's treatment of each question reveals both philosophical sophistication and practical wisdom born of a lifetime's experience in politics, law, and philosophy. Book 1 explores what is morally right by analyzing the 4 cardinal virtues: wisdom, justice, courage, and temperance. For each virtue, Cicero shows not just what it means in theory, but how it guides action in practice. Wisdom requires not just theoretical knowledge, but practical judgment about what should be done. Justice demands not just avoiding harm, but actively contributing to common welfare. Courage means not just physical bravery, but moral strength to do right, despite danger or unpopularity. Temperance involves not just moderation in pleasure, but appropriate dignity and decorum in all behavior. Cicero's treatment of justice is particularly rich. He identifies 2 fundamental principles: harm no one and contribute to common good. The first principle prohibits injustice, violence, fraud, breach of contract, abuse of trust. But mere refraining from harm isn't enough. Justice requires positive contribution to one's community, family, friends, and even humanity as a whole. This positive conception of justice grounds Cicero's theory of duty. We have duties to all human beings simply because they are human. Duties of common humanity that prohibit treating anyone as mere means. We have special duties to those with whom we have particular relationships: family, friends, fellow citizens, clients, colleagues. These duties aren't just restraints on self-interest, but positive requirements to support, help, and serve others. Cicero organizes these duties hierarchically. Duties to humanity as a whole come first. We must never violate basic human rights, even to benefit our community. Duties to one's country come next. Public welfare takes precedence over private interest. Then come duties to family, friends, and benefactors. This hierarchy provides guidance when duties conflict. Serve country over personal interest. Serve humanity over narrow nationalism. Serve justice over friendship. This ranking reflects both Stoic cosmopolitanism and Roman civic virtue. The Stoics taught that all human beings share rational nature and are therefore fellow citizens of a cosmic city. Roman tradition emphasized duty to the Republic as the highest secular calling. Cicero synthesizes these, creating an ethical framework that honors both universal human dignity and particular civic obligations. Book 1 also addresses questions of decorum and appropriateness, proprietas. How we act matters beyond what we do. Manner, timing, context all bear moral significance. The same action can be right or wrong, depending on how it's done. Speaking harsh truths may be appropriate for a cynic philosopher, but inappropriate for a statesman. Withdrawing from politics may be right for someone with no talent for public affairs, but wrong for someone who could serve the common good. This attention to propriety reflects Cicero's understanding that virtue must be expressed appropriately to be genuine. Abstract correctness isn't enough. The virtuous person must judge what fits their role, circumstances, and abilities. Ethics requires not just following rules, but exercising judgment about how principles apply in particular situations. Book 2 examines what is beneficial or useful, utile. Cicero identifies different kinds of benefits: wealth and resources, honor and reputation, power and influence, and health and security. Each can be pursued rightly or wrongly. Wealth is good when acquired honestly and used well, evil when gained through injustice or hoarded selfishly. Reputation is valuable when deserved and sought through virtue, worthless when based on flattery or vice. Power is beneficial when used for justice, harmful when sought for domination. Cicero's analysis shows that genuine advantage requires virtue. The unjust person may gain external goods temporarily, but will suffer from guilt, fear, distrust of others, and inability to form real friendships. They face constant danger from rivals and enemies. Even if they escape punishment, they never achieve inner peace. True benefit, the stable, satisfying life, requires living justly. This argument isn't just theoretical, but draws on Cicero's observation of Roman politics. He had watched ambitious men pursue power through violence and betrayal, achieving temporary success, but ultimately destroying themselves. Caesar gained absolute power, but was murdered by former allies. Sulla won civil war, but retired in bitterness. Marius and Cinna terrorized Rome, but died violently. Even apparent success in vice, Cicero argues, isn't truly beneficial. More positively, Cicero shows how virtue itself benefits us. Living justly wins trust and friendship. Acting courageously earns respect. Showing wisdom attracts followers. Being temperate preserves health and dignity. The virtuous person achieves influence not through fear, but through deserved authority. People want to follow someone they trust and admire. Book 3 addresses the most difficult question. What do we do when moral rightness and apparent advantage conflict? When doing the right thing seems to require sacrificing benefit, which should we choose? Cicero's answer is unequivocal. The morally right must always take precedence, and in fact, genuine advantage can never conflict with righteousness. This principle seems obvious stated abstractly, but is challenging in practice. Cicero examines cases where advantage and rightness appear to conflict. Should a seller disclose hidden defects in goods when disclosure will reduce the price? Should a ship captain distribute limited food to passengers or reserve it for crew needed to navigate? Should a good person take a place in a lifeboat that would save a less worthy person? Should a general break faith with enemies when doing so would save his army? In case after case, Cicero argues that the apparently advantageous immoral action actually isn't beneficial when fully understood. Dishonest trading ruins reputation and makes future transactions impossible. Sacrificing passengers for crew may save the ship, but makes the captain a murderer. Taking another's place in a lifeboat violates human fellowship. Breaking faith with enemies destroys one's own honor and encourages future treachery. The fundamental point is that our true good as human beings consists in living according to our rational, social nature. Actions that violate justice or humanity damage what's most essential to our welfare, our character and our relationships with others. Apparent advantages gained through vice are like poisoned food. They may seem beneficial initially, but ultimately destroy us. This uncompromising insistence that virtue cannot genuinely conflict with advantage would influence Western ethics profoundly. It grounds Cicero's political philosophy. States cannot truly benefit from injustice, even when military victory or economic gain follows. It shapes his legal theory. No law that violates natural justice can legitimately claim authority. It defines his statesmanship. Leaders must serve justice and common good, not private or factional interest. Diophysius concludes with Cicero acknowledging that he has given his son philosophy's most practical gift, guidance for living well and serving nobly. Whether Marcus benefited from this guidance is unclear. He became a capable military commander, but not a philosopher. What's certain is that Cicero's gift extended far beyond his son to influence centuries of ethical thought. Medieval readers found in Diophysius a philosophical ethics compatible with Christian morality. Renaissance humanists used it as a textbook of civic virtue. Enlightenment thinkers drew on it for political philosophy. The American founders read Cicero and absorbed his teachings about duty, justice, and republican virtue. Today's applied ethics, business ethics, professional ethics, bioethics, continue the Ciceronian project of bringing philosophical principles to bear on concrete, practical questions. Part 11. The Final Struggle. Cicero's last months were spent not in philosophical withdrawal, but in desperate political action. After Caesar's assassination on March 15th, 44 BCE, Cicero hoped that the Republic might be restored. He supported the assassins, Brutus and Cassius, though he hadn't been part of the conspiracy. He opposed Mark Antony's attempt to seize power as Caesar's successor, and he delivered his greatest speeches, the Philippics, attacking Antony in language so fierce that it sealed Cicero's fate. The Philippics represent philosophy in action, Cicero using all his rhetorical skill, political wisdom, and moral courage to defend republican government against tyranny. Drawing on his philosophical understanding of justice, legitimate power, and civic duty, he argued that Antony's rule was fundamentally unjust and that Romans had a duty to resist. What sort of death can be untimely for a man who is old, or dishonourable for a consul, or miserable for a wise man? Cicero asked in the Second Philippic. He knew the danger he faced, but considered it worth risking everything for the Republic. Philosophy had taught him that living virtuously mattered more than living safely, that some principles were worth dying for, that the good citizen serves their country even at personal cost. But philosophy had also taught him realism about political outcomes. Cicero knew the Republic was probably doomed, that the forces favoring monarchy were too strong, that his political position was weak. Yet he acted anyway, not because he expected to win, but because acting rightly mattered, regardless of consequences. This was stoicism lived rather than merely studied, doing one's duty regardless of outcomes, maintaining virtue even in defeat. The political situation quickly deteriorated. Octavian, later Augustus Caesar, Julius Caesar's adopted son and heir, initially allied with the Senate and Cicero against Antony. But in November 43 BCE, Octavian betrayed this alliance and joined with Antony and Lepidus to form the Second Triumvirate. They divided power and resources, and they identified enemies to be killed, and their property confiscated in proscriptions that recalled the worst horrors of Sulla's dictatorship decades earlier. Cicero's name was high on the proscription list. Mark Antony wanted revenge for the Philippics. On December 7th, 43 BCE, assassins found Cicero at his villa near Gaeta as he attempted to flee. According to Plutarch's account, Cicero ordered his servants not to resist and stretched his neck out from the litter to make the executioner's task easier, meeting death with the stoic calm he had written about, but which few achieve in practice. Antony ordered that Cicero's head and hands, the parts that had spoken and written against him, be cut off and displayed in the Roman Forum. It was a deliberate humiliation, a warning to any who might use eloquence against power. The Forum, where Cicero had triumphed as a young advocate, had denounced Catiline as consul, had defended republican values in his final speeches, now displayed his mutilated remains. Yet this grotesque display paradoxically vindicated Cicero's philosophy. The triumvirs could kill him and display his body parts, but they couldn't kill the ideas he had expressed or destroy the works he had written. Philosophy might not protect its adherents from tyrants, but it created something that survived tyranny. Part 12. The Eternal Legacy. 2,000 years after his death, Cicero's influence on Western thought remains profound and pervasive. In philosophy, politics, law, rhetoric, education, and culture, we still think in categories, use concepts, and pursue ideals that Cicero shaped. Understanding his legacy requires examining how different aspects of his thought influenced later history. First, Cicero's philosophical legacy. He preserved Greek philosophical thought for Latin-speaking Western Europe. During the Middle Ages, when knowledge of Greek was rare in the West, educated people encountered Plato, Aristotle, the Stoics, and Epicureans largely through Cicero's Latin works. His philosophical vocabulary became standard. The Latin terms he coined for philosophical concepts shaped how medieval and modern thinkers understood those concepts. More profoundly, Cicero's model of philosophy as practical wisdom, rather than abstract speculation, influenced how Western culture understood philosophy's purpose. The medieval ideal of philosophy as handmaid to theology, providing rational support for religious truth and ethical guidance for life, owed much to Ciceronian precedent. Renaissance humanists embraced Cicero's integration of eloquence with wisdom. Even modern philosophy, despite its technical specialization, continues the Ciceronian project of addressing fundamental human questions about knowledge, value, and conduct. Second, Cicero's political legacy. His theory of natural law became foundational for Western legal and political thought. Medieval canon lawyers and theologians like Aquinas developed Ciceronian natural law into systematic theories that grounded law in reason and morality rather than mere power. The idea that unjust laws lack genuine authority, that legitimate government must serve justice and common good, that all human beings possess basic rights, these principles trace back through centuries to Ciceronian foundations. The American founding provides perhaps the clearest example of Ciceronian influence. The founders read Cicero extensively and absorbed his teachings about republican government, mixed constitution, civic virtue, and the dangers of tyranny. When they argued that government must be limited by law, that power must be divided to prevent tyranny, that citizens have both rights and duties, that leadership requires virtue as well as ability. They were developing Ciceronian themes for modern circumstances. John Adams called Cicero's works the finest compositions of antiquity. Thomas Jefferson kept Cicero's works in his library and drew on them in his writing. The ideal of the philosopher-statesman that inspired the founders to see themselves as both political leaders and political theorists reflected Ciceronian precedent. Third, Cicero's influence on rhetoric and education. For centuries, Cicero's rhetorical works and speeches were textbooks for learning Latin prose style, logical argument, and persuasive speaking. The 5 parts of rhetoric, invention, arrangement, style, memory, delivery, were studied through Ciceronian texts. The ideal of the educated person as someone who combines knowledge with eloquence, who can think clearly and express themselves persuasively, reflects Ciceronian influence. Modern education systems that emphasize both analytical skills and communication abilities, that value both specialized knowledge and broad understanding, that aim to develop both intellectual capability and practical judgment, continue the Ciceronian educational tradition. The liberal arts curriculum, combining humanities, sciences, and social studies to develop well-rounded individuals capable of civic leadership, descends from Cicero's vision of philosophical education for public service. Fourth, Cicero's humanistic legacy. The Renaissance ideal of humanitas, the cultivation of all distinctively human capacities through study of literature, history, philosophy, and rhetoric, took Cicero as its model and guide. Petrarch wrote letters to Cicero addressing him as a friend and teacher. Erasmus praised Cicero's eloquence and moral philosophy. The Renaissance gentleman, learned in classical literature and philosophy, virtuous in conduct, effective in public affairs, eloquent in expression, was a Ciceronian ideal adapted to early modern Europe. This humanistic tradition influenced not just elite culture, but democratic ideals. If all human beings share rational nature and capacity for virtue, then all deserve respect and opportunity for development. If excellence comes from cultivation rather than birth, then education should be widely available. If civic virtue matters for republican government, then citizens need philosophical and rhetorical education. These egalitarian implications of Ciceronian humanism helped shape modern democratic culture. Fifth, Cicero's ethical legacy. His practical ethics, the treatment of friendship, aging, duty, the good life, shaped how Western culture thought about these matters for 2 millennia. When people thought about friendship as based on virtue rather than mere advantage, they were thinking Ciceronianly. When they understood aging as potentially dignified rather than simply decline, they drew on Ciceronian resources. When they struggled to balance private interest with public duty, competing loyalties with overarching principles, they worked with categories and concepts Cicero had articulated. Diophysius in particular exerted extraordinary influence. Medieval moral theology, Renaissance political thought, Enlightenment ethics, and modern applied ethics all drew on its analysis of duty, justice, and moral conflict. The casuistical method, reasoning carefully about particular cases rather than applying general rules mechanically, that characterizes much Western moral thought, owes a large debt to Ciceronian precedent. Sixth, Cicero's personal example. Beyond his philosophical doctrines, Cicero's life, his rise from provincial origins to Rome's highest offices through talent and effort, his combination of philosophical learning with political engagement, his defense of republican values against tyranny, his courage in facing death, inspired later generations. For those living under oppression, Cicero showed that speaking truth to power is worth doing, even when it fails. For those trying to combine intellectual work with public service, he modeled how philosophy can inform action. For those facing death or loss, he demonstrated how philosophical wisdom can provide consolation and courage. The Roman Stoic philosophers who came after Cicero, Seneca, Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, developed Stoicism with full awareness of Cicero's work. The Latin Church Fathers, Lactantius, Ambrose, Jerome, Augustine, engaged deeply with Cicero's philosophy even as they incorporated it into Christian frameworks. Medieval scholars like Aquinas, Renaissance humanists like Petrarch and Erasmus, Enlightenment philosophers like Voltaire and Hume all acknowledged debts to Cicero. Even those who rejected Cicero's positions often did so in dialogue with him. Machiavelli's realistic political philosophy was partly a rejection of Ciceronian idealism. Montaigne's skepticism developed from academic skepticism that Cicero had articulated. Modern critics who reject natural law theory are rejecting a framework Cicero helped establish. This enduring influence reflects not just historical accident, but genuine philosophical achievement. Cicero addressed fundamental human questions about justice, duty, the good life, knowledge, virtue, friendship, death, questions every generation must face anew. He offered answers that combined philosophical sophistication with practical wisdom, that honored both reason and experience, that served both individual and community. Moreover, Cicero showed how philosophy could be expressed beautifully as well as truthfully. His prose style, clear, elegant, powerful, made philosophy accessible without oversimplifying. His dialogues dramatized philosophical inquiry, showing how intelligent people wrestle with fundamental questions. His speeches demonstrated how philosophical principles could be applied to concrete political and legal issues. Part 13. The Living Relevance. What makes Cicero relevant today, 2 millennia after his death in a political system radically different from ours? Why should modern readers engage with his philosophy beyond historical interest? First, Cicero addresses perennial human questions that transcend particular times and cultures. How should we balance self-interest with duty to others? What makes a life well lived? How can we maintain integrity when faced with powerful pressures to compromise? What do we owe our communities? How should we face loss, aging, and death? These questions are as urgent now as in Cicero's time, and his answers remain compelling. Second, Cicero's political philosophy speaks directly to contemporary concerns about democracy, justice, and the rule of law. His warnings about how republics fail through demagoguery, corruption, concentration of power, loss of civic virtue, describe dangers that democratic societies still face. His insistence that legitimate government must serve justice and common good rather than narrow interests remains a crucial principle for evaluating political systems and actions. The concept of natural law that Cicero articulated provides foundations for human rights that many find more compelling than alternatives. If rights depend only on positive law or social agreement, they can be revoked by legislation or popular will. But if they're grounded in human nature and accessible to reason, they provide a standpoint for criticizing unjust laws and oppressive governments. Third, Cicero's ethics addresses practical challenges we all face. His analysis of duty provides guidance for navigating competing obligations and apparent conflicts between principle and advantage. His treatment of friendship illuminates a relationship crucial to human happiness, but often misunderstood or devalued. His reflections on aging offer philosophical resources for facing a challenge that modern medicine has made more common but no less difficult. Fourth, Cicero models an integrated life that many aspire to but few achieve, combining intellectual excellence with practical effectiveness, philosophical reflection with public engagement, pursuit of truth with service to community. In an age of increasing specialization, where academics are often isolated from public affairs and political leaders often lack philosophical depth, Cicero's example reminds us that wisdom should inform action, and that the examined life should be a politically engaged life. Fifth, Cicero's rhetorical and educational legacy remains relevant for democratic citizenship. Democracy requires citizens who can think critically, communicate clearly, and participate effectively in public deliberation. Cicero's vision of education that develops both analytical capability and expressive eloquence, both specialized knowledge and broad understanding, speaks to ongoing debates about educational purpose and content. His insistence that eloquence requires wisdom and wisdom requires eloquence challenges both those who value communication skills without substantive knowledge and those who pursue technical expertise without ability to explain or persuade. The complete citizen, like Cicero's ideal orator, must combine knowledge, judgment, and expression. Sixth, Cicero's philosophical method, skeptical, syncretic, practical, offers an alternative to both dogmatic certainty and nihilistic relativism. In a pluralistic world where we encounter diverse philosophical, religious, and cultural perspectives, Cicero's approach of taking different viewpoints seriously, extracting insights from multiple traditions, and seeking probable wisdom rather than absolute certainty, provides a model for intellectual engagement. His academic skepticism doesn't mean that all views are equally valid or that we can't achieve practical certainty sufficient for action. Rather, it means remaining open to revision, recognizing the complexity of truth, and proportioning belief to evidence. This epistemological humility combined with practical confidence characterizes philosophical maturity. Finally, Cicero demonstrates that philosophy matters most in difficult times. He produced his greatest philosophical works not in the security of academic retirement, but during political chaos, personal loss, and mortal danger. Philosophy for Cicero was not escapism, but equipment for living, resources for facing life's challenges with courage, wisdom, and dignity. When Cicero wrote about bearing grief while mourning Tullia, about maintaining virtue while watching the Republic collapse, about facing death while assassins sought him, he wasn't speculating abstractly but forging wisdom from experience. This tested wisdom, earned through suffering and refined through reflection, speaks with authority that purely theoretical philosophy lacks. For readers today facing their own challenges, political dysfunction, moral confusion, personal loss, professional pressures, Cicero offers not easy answers but hard-won wisdom. He shows how philosophical reflection can illuminate practical choices, how virtue can be maintained even in corrupt systems, how meaning can be found even in failure, how dignity can be preserved even in death. Part 14. The Voice Across Centuries. On that December day in 43 BCE, when Cicero's severed head and hands were displayed in the Forum, it might have seemed that tyranny had triumphed over philosophy, that power had silenced wisdom, that violence had defeated eloquence. The triumvirs had killed their critic and mutilated his body as a warning to any who might use words against force. But they could not silence what Cicero had written. They could not destroy the ideas he had expressed or undo the influence he had already exerted. Within decades, his philosophical works were being read and studied throughout the Roman world. Within centuries, they had shaped Christian theology and medieval philosophy. Within a millennium, they were guiding Renaissance humanists in their recovery of classical culture. Within 2 millennia, they had influenced the American founding and modern democratic ideals. Cicero lives today not in the statues erected to him or the festivals celebrating him, but in the concepts we use, the principles we invoke, the ideals we pursue. When we speak of natural law or human rights, we use categories Cicero helped create. When we study rhetoric or practice law, we engage traditions Cicero shaped. When we try to balance competing duties or maintain integrity under pressure, we grapple with questions Cicero illuminated. His voice speaks across 20 centuries with remarkable clarity and continuing relevance. We hear it when we read his works directly, but also when we encounter his ideas transmitted through countless later thinkers who read, absorbed, and developed Ciceronian themes. We hear it in the Latin language he mastered and transformed into a vehicle for philosophy. We hear it in the republican ideals he defended and articulated. We hear it in the educational traditions he influenced and the ethical questions he explored. What makes Cicero's voice still audible across such distance is not just the accident of textual preservation, but the enduring value of what he said. He addressed fundamental questions about human existence that each generation must face. How should we live? What do we owe each other? How can we create just communities? What makes life meaningful? How should we face loss and death? His answers combined philosophical depth with practical wisdom, intellectual rigor with eloquent expression, Greek learning with Roman virtue. Cicero was not always consistent. His academic skepticism meant he saw truth in multiple perspectives and changed his mind when arguments convinced him. He was not always successful. His political career ended in failure, and his philosophical ideals weren't realized in his lifetime. He was not always admirable. His ego sometimes overwhelmed his judgment. His rhetoric occasionally exceeded truth. His political maneuvering sometimes compromised his principles. But Cicero at his best, courageously defending justice, eloquently articulating truth, wisely counseling virtue, gracefully facing loss, exemplifies what philosophy can achieve. He shows how thought can illuminate action, how wisdom can guide power, how eloquence can serve truth, how one person's voice can influence civilization. The ultimate testament to Cicero's achievement is that we still engage with his thought, not as mere historical curiosity, but as living philosophy that can guide and challenge us. When we read On Duties today, we're not just learning what Romans thought about ethics, but wrestling with genuine moral questions about obligation, justice, and integrity. When we study On the Republic, we're not just examining ancient political theory, but reflecting on fundamental questions about legitimate government and civic virtue. Cicero's gift to Western civilization was not a comprehensive philosophical system. He explicitly rejected such dogmatic systematization, but something more valuable: a method for seeking wisdom, a vocabulary for expressing it, a model for applying it, and exemplary works that demonstrate how philosophy serves life. In an age of increasing specialization and narrow expertise, when academics pursue increasingly technical questions in increasingly isolated disciplines, Cicero reminds us of philosophy's original and essential purpose: helping human beings understand how to live well and create just communities. In an age when political discourse often degenerates into partisan sloganeering and manipulation, Cicero exemplifies how eloquence can serve wisdom rather than corrupting it. In an age when many feel powerless before large impersonal forces, Cicero shows how individual voice and virtue matter. Perhaps most importantly for our troubled times, Cicero demonstrates that philosophy's value isn't measured by whether it achieves immediate practical success. The republic Cicero defended fell despite his efforts. The philosophical ideals he articulated weren't realized in Roman politics. The personal cost of his principled opposition to tyranny was his life. Yet Cicero succeeded in a deeper sense. He preserved ancient wisdom for future generations. He created works of enduring beauty and insight. He modeled intellectual courage and civic virtue. He showed how to maintain integrity even in defeat and dignity even in death. He proved that ideas matter, that philosophy serves life, that one voice speaking truth can influence millennia. When we read Cicero today, we engage not with a dead author, but with a living voice, a voice that speaks across centuries about perennial human concerns with wisdom, eloquence, and passion. We encounter not just historical texts, but philosophical resources for facing our own challenges and pursuing our own ideals. We discover not just what Romans thought, but what human beings can think about justice and duty, virtue and happiness, community and individual, action and contemplation. Cicero's severed head displayed in the Forum was meant to show philosophy's impotence before power. Instead, it demonstrated philosophy's triumph. The tyrants who killed him are remembered primarily as Cicero's murderers. The empire that replaced the republic he loved eventually fell. But Cicero's words remain, still read, still influential, still capable of moving minds and shaping lives. This is philosophy's ultimate vindication. Not that it always prevents injustice or saves republics or protects philosophers, but that it creates something that transcends mortality and tyranny and historical contingency. Through philosophy, human beings can understand more deeply, choose more wisely, and live more nobly. Through philosophy, one person can speak across centuries to unknown readers, offering wisdom earned through thought and tested through experience. Cicero's life demonstrates that the examined life, the philosophical life, is worth living not because it guarantees success or safety, but because it makes us more fully human. His death demonstrates that philosophy can sustain us even in failure and loss. His enduring influence demonstrates that wisdom, eloquently expressed and courageously lived, achieves a kind of immortality that power and wealth never attain. The voice that spoke in the Forum 2,000 years ago still speaks today to anyone willing to listen, teaching us about justice, challenging us to virtue, inspiring us to excellence, showing us how philosophy can illuminate life and how one person's thought can shape civilization. That voice invites us not merely to study Cicero, but to continue the conversation he exemplified, the endless human dialogue about how we should live, what we should value, who we should become. In accepting that invitation, in engaging seriously with Cicero's thought, in wrestling with the questions he explored and testing the answers he proposed, we become participants in a tradition of wisdom-seeking that spans millennia. We discover that philosophy is not just academic specialization or historical curiosity, but living inquiry into the most important questions human beings face. And we learn that although we cannot defeat death, or prevent tragedy or ensure justice, we can think clearly, choose rightly, live nobly, and contribute something of value to the human conversation across generations. This is Cicero's gift and his challenge, to recognize that philosophy matters, that wisdom can guide action, that eloquence can serve truth, that virtue can be maintained even in dark times, and that each of us can contribute to the ongoing human effort to understand how we should live and create a more just world. The voice across centuries still speaks. The question is whether we will listen, learn, and continue the conversation. Part 15. The Unity of Thought and Action. Cicero's central philosophical insight, the principle unifying his contributions to ethics, politics, rhetoric, and epistemology, is the fundamental integration of contemplation and action, theory and practice, wisdom and eloquence. This integration was both the defining characteristic of his life and the organizing principle of his philosophical project. Greek philosophy had developed a sharp separation between contemplative and active life. Plato suggested that pure contemplation of eternal forms was superior to political engagement. Aristotle explicitly ranked the contemplative life above the political life. The Hellenistic schools deepened this divide. Epicureans withdrew from politics entirely, Stoics participated reluctantly as duty, and academics focused on theoretical disputes. This hierarchy reflected Greek cultural assumptions where philosophy meant theoretical insight into eternal truths, while politics belonged to the realm of mere opinion and change. But this hierarchy was fundamentally incompatible with Roman values. Roman culture celebrated public service as the highest calling and practical effectiveness as the supreme virtue. The Roman who withdrew from public life to pursue private contemplation was shirking duty and betraying the republic. Cicero's great achievement was reconciling philosophy with Roman civic virtue by reconceiving philosophy itself. He argued that genuine wisdom must inform action, and that the highest philosophical life is the engaged life of the philosophical statesman. Contemplation divorced from action is sterile. Action uninformed by wisdom is blind. The complete human life requires both, their integration into a unified existence where thought guides deed and experience enriches understanding. In De Republica, Cicero argues through Scipio that those who have devoted themselves entirely to philosophy have been unable to render their fellow citizens such great service as those who have combined theoretical learning with practical experience. Philosophy provides understanding of justice, virtue, and human nature, but this understanding achieves its purpose only when applied to actual governance and civic leadership. This doesn't mean contemplation has merely instrumental value. Cicero genuinely believed that understanding truth is intrinsically valuable and that intellectual activity is among the highest human pleasures. Rather, his point is that contemplation and action are not competing goods requiring choice, but complementary aspects of complete human flourishing. The statesman who acts without wisdom acts blindly. The philosopher who thinks without acting wastes their wisdom and neglects their duty to community. Only the philosophical statesman who combines thought with action achieves fully integrated human excellence. This integration shaped Cicero's approach to every philosophical topic. His epistemology emphasized practical certainty sufficient for action, rather than theoretical certainty that would paralyze decision-making. His ethics focused on duties and choices we actually face. His political philosophy addressed concrete problems of governance. His rhetoric insisted that eloquence must serve wisdom, and wisdom must achieve eloquence. Even his skepticism served this project. By refusing dogmatic commitment to any single school, he remained free to draw on multiple traditions and focus on probable truths adequate for guiding action. The personal cost was considerable. Cicero could have withdrawn from politics after his consulship, avoiding the dangers that eventually killed him. The Epicurean path of withdrawal offered safety and tranquility, but his philosophy wouldn't permit this. If he truly believed wisdom should inform action, and that the philosophical life is the politically engaged life, then he had to remain engaged even when dangerous. This commitment appears most clearly in Cicero's final months. After Caesar's assassination, despite being over 60 with every reason to retire, he delivered the Philippics attacking Mark Antony with courage, born of philosophical conviction. When friends warned that his speeches were signing his death warrant, Cicero reportedly replied, "What kind of death can be untimely for a man who is old, or dishonorable for a consul, or miserable for a wise man?" This was not bravado, but philosophical consistency. If wisdom teaches that virtue matters more than survival, that some principles are worth dying for, then the philosopher must act accordingly when tested. Cicero's execution vindicated his philosophy in a way that escape never could. By dying for his principles, he demonstrated that philosophy is not merely academic game-playing, but a guide for life that demands everything when circumstances require. The severed head and hands displayed in the forum testified not to philosophy's impotence, but to its power. Power sufficient to threaten tyrants, power that survives death through ideas that cannot be executed. The integration of thought and action that Cicero exemplified would profoundly influence Western intellectual history. The medieval ideal of contemplative and active life coexisting and enriching each other owes much to Ciceronian precedent. Renaissance humanists embraced his vision of the complete person, combining learning with civic engagement. Enlightenment philosophers trying to influence political reform followed Ciceronian models. Even modern expectations that philosophers should explain ideas clearly and address important questions reflect Ciceronian influence. But Cicero's integration also challenges contemporary intellectual life. Modern specialization creates pressure toward narrow expertise without practical application. Academic philosophy often becomes technical discussions using inaccessible jargon. Political leadership often lacks philosophical depth, guided by polls rather than principled understanding of justice and human flourishing. Cicero reminds us that this separation of thought from action, philosophy from politics, represents failure rather than achievement. The complete thinker must be engaged in the world, bringing philosophical insight to practical problems. The complete leader must be philosophically informed, grounding action in reasoned understanding. The complete citizen must combine intellectual capability with practical judgment, specialized knowledge with broad wisdom. This Ciceronian ideal seems utopian in our specialized modern world. We cannot all be philosopher-statesmen combining Cicero's eloquence, learning, and political influence. But the ideal still matters as aspiration and critique. It challenges academics to make work accessible and relevant. It challenges political leaders to ground policies in principled understanding. It challenges all citizens to develop both intellectual capacity to understand complex issues and practical judgment to act effectively. Most fundamentally, Cicero's integration reminds us that philosophy is not optional luxury, but essential equipment for living. We all face questions about how to live, what to value, how to balance competing obligations, what principles to uphold even at cost. Philosophy provides resources for thinking through these questions carefully, rather than defaulting to convention or immediate interest. And we all have opportunities to bring whatever wisdom we achieve to bear on our circumstances, to act with integrity in professional lives, to contribute to communities, to stand for principles, to resist injustice when we encounter it. Philosophy fulfills its purpose not in libraries, but in the lived experience of people trying to act wisely in complex circumstances. Cicero's life demonstrates both the possibility and cost of this integrated philosophical existence. It's possible to combine serious intellectual work with effective practical action, to maintain principles under pressure, to serve both truth and community. But it's also costly, requiring enormous energy, accepting risks, facing failures, and sometimes paying the ultimate price. Yet Cicero would argue that this integrated life is worth living, precisely because it's complete in ways that pure contemplation or thoughtless action cannot be. The person who thinks deeply but never acts remains half human, failing to realize their nature as a social, political being. The person who acts constantly but never reflects remains half conscious, failing to understand their choices or purposes. Only in the integration of thought with action, wisdom with eloquence, contemplation with engagement, do we achieve full humanity. This vision of integrated excellence, demanding, costly but fulfilling, remains Cicero's most profound gift to Western civilization. It continues to challenge anyone who would separate mind from world, theory from practice, thought from action. The voice that spoke in the Roman Forum calling citizens to virtue, the hand that wrote philosophical dialogues integrating Greek wisdom with Roman virtue, the life that combined learning with leadership and principle with courage. These testify to philosophy's highest possibility. Not philosophy as academic specialization or intellectual game, but philosophy as Cicero lived it. Wisdom guiding action, thought informing deed, the examined life engaged with the world it examines. Cicero achieved this integrated excellence imperfectly. He was vain, sometimes vindictive, occasionally inconsistent, ultimately unsuccessful in preserving the Republic. But at his best, defending justice eloquently, articulating wisdom clearly, facing death courageously, he exemplified what philosophy can achieve and what philosophical life can mean. The integration he embodied remains relevant precisely because the separation of thought from action, wisdom from power, understanding from effectiveness, continues to plague us. We need philosopher-statesmen who combine knowledge with judgment, academics who make learning accessible, citizens who think carefully and act effectively, leaders who ground policy in principled understanding. This is the final lesson of Cicero's life and thought, that the philosophical life and the civic life are not competing alternatives requiring choice, but aspects of unified human excellence that each of us, in our own circumstances and capacities, should strive to achieve. The voice across centuries calls us not to withdraw from the world to study philosophy or to abandon philosophy for thoughtless action, but to live philosophically in the world, bringing wisdom to bear on action, testing theory through practice, and achieving the integrated excellence that makes us fully human. The republic Cicero loved fell. The philosophical certainty he sought eluded him. The political success he pursued was temporary. The life he built ended violently. Yet what he created through the integration of thought and action, wisdom and eloquence, philosophy and civic virtue, survives and speaks and continues to influence how we think about knowledge, value, duty, justice, and human possibility. Cicero's gift to us is not a philosophical system to adopt or doctrines to memorize, but a model of philosophical life to inspire us, and resources for philosophical living to guide us. His challenge to us is to continue the integration he pioneered, to think carefully about fundamental questions, to act on the principles we discover, to speak eloquently for truth and justice, and to pursue the complete human excellence that unites wisdom with virtue, knowledge with action, and thought with deed in service of the highest human possibilities.